A felled oak, thick as a barrel, hangs on ropes above an open pit in the yard at Chatham. One man stands on top of the trunk, another down in the dark of the pit below him, and between them a saw longer than a man is tall bites slowly into the wood, turning a tree into the beginning of a warship. A few yards away, the bones of that warship already stand inside the stone dock, a vast skeleton of oak rising into the Kentish sky, shaped by nothing but muscle, hand tools, and time. None of this belonged to the age of the machine. It came decades before hydraulics, before steam power, before any engine of any kind had reached a shipyard. And still, oak by oak and plank by plank, the men in this yard built the most famous warship the world would ever see. You know her as HMS Victory. Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, the ship at the heart of the most celebrated sea battle in British history. But long before she ever carried an admiral into legend, she was a problem to be solved in a dockyard. A thing that had to be dragged out of a forest and forced into the shape of a ship entirely by hand. And on the morning she was finally finished, that same dockyard would very nearly become her grave. After 6 years of labor, the ship they had built would find that she could not get out of the dock that built her. This is not the story of the admiral who made her famous, nor the battle that made her a legend. It is the story of the yard that shaped her, the tools that cut her, and the men who willed a 3,500-ton Leviathan into existence with their bare hands. Over the next half hour, we are going to build her from nothing. We start in the forest among the trees that became her. We climb down into the sawpits where that timber was cut to shape. We raise her frame, plank her hull, and then watch her stand silent and unfinished for 3 long years. And we end on the launch day that almost went wrong. It begins in the woods. Because before she was a ship, before she was a name, a first-rate ship of the line was simply an enormous quantity of wood. Victory swallowed something close to 6,000 trees. Around 300,000 cubic feet of timber went into her frame and her hull, the yield of roughly 100 acres of mature woodland. Picture a forest you could walk across in an afternoon, every tree in it felled, dragged, floated, and hauled to a single dock on the River Medway. Close to 90% of that timber was English oak, most of it cut from the Weald of Kent. The remaining tenth or so was elm, pine, and fir. Oak because oak was hard, heavy, dense, and stubborn, the one wood that could take the strain of a gun deck and the pounding of the sea and refuse to give way. And Victory did not need one great oak or 100. She needed thousands of them. The men at Chatham were not working from poured metal or finished parts. They were building a warship out of a forest, one tree at a time. To understand how a ship is grown out of a forest, we have to go back to Chatham, to the summer of 1759, and to a long trench of stone cut into the ground beside the River Medway. Victory was not built on a slipway. Most great ships of her age were. A slipway is a ramp of heavy timber that runs down into the water, and a hull built on one is set free by knocking away its supports and letting it slide, stern first, into the river. Victory's story does not work that way, and that difference will decide everything on the day she is finally finished. She was built inside a dry dock. The old single dock at Chatham was a vast pit walled and floored in stone, shaped like the underside of a ship, with 2 enormous timber gates standing at the river end. Open the gates and the sea flooded in. Close them and pump the water out, and a ship sat cradled on wooden blocks at the bottom, high and dry, with men able to walk the full length of her keel on solid ground. Nothing about this dock was built for sliding. When her day came, the water would be let back in, and she would be floated up off her blocks and carried out through those gates on the tide. She was built inside stone walls, and when her time came, she would leave the same way, floated out rather than slid down. Remember the gates. The first timber went down on the 23rd of July, 1759, and it was not oak. The keel, the long backbone that runs the entire length of a ship's bottom and carries every ton built above it, was elm. That seems wrong until you understand the wood. Oak was the ship, but oak that is soaked and then dried, soaked and then dried again, will eventually rot from the inside. Elm behaves in the opposite way. Elm rots only in the dry. Keep it permanently underwater and it lasts almost forever. And the one timber on any ship that is never once lifted out of the water is the keel. So the shipwrights laid the part that would spend its whole life submerged in the single wood that thrives there, and raised the great oak animal on top of it. The shape of that animal, the run of her lines, the exact curve of every rib, came from the mind of one man, Sir Thomas Slade, senior surveyor of the Navy, the most trusted warship designer in the country. Slade did not conjure Victory out of nothing. He copied her lines from a ship he already believed in, the 100-gun HMS Royal George, a proven first-rate that had earned its reputation at sea. Around 150 men worked her in that stone dock. Shipwrights and sawyers, caulkers and their apprentices, a small town of skilled hands bent over one object for years on end. She did not yet have a name. That came in 1760, and the name they chose told you everything about the country that was building her. Britain was locked in the 7 Years' War, and the year just gone, 1759, had been almost unbelievable. Later generations would call it the Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles, the year of victories. British soldiers had stormed the heights and taken Quebec. They had broken a French army in the field at Minden. The Navy had shattered one French fleet off Lagos, then hunted down and destroyed a second in a screaming gale among the rocks at Quiberon Bay. Victory after victory crowded into a single year. And so the greatest ship in the yard was not named for any one of those battles. She was named for all of them together, Victory. A warship christened not for a triumph she had won, but for a year an entire nation could not stop celebrating. The stone dock held her. The elm spine lay along the blocks. Now the yard had to take a forest of felled timber and cut every piece of it to the shape Slade had drawn. And that meant thousands of trunks, each one turned into planks and frames by nothing but 2 men and a saw. 2 men and a saw. That is what it came down to, thousands of times over, for years. The machine that turned a forest into a warship had no engine and no name. It was a hole in the ground. Across the yard at Chatham, the earth was dug out into long pits, each one deep enough for a man to stand upright inside it, and over every pit a felled oak trunk was rolled and pinned in place. This was a saw pit, and it was where raw timber became something a shipwright could use. It was old, simple, and brutally effective, the standard way a dockyard turned trunks into planks in the age of sail. And the work inside it was as hard as any in the yard. Every pit took 2 men and 1 long saw. The saw was a whipsaw. A straight blade worked from both ends at once. One man stood on top of the log. He was the top-sawyer, and he was the skilled one. He set the line of the cut and followed it, guiding the blade down the length of the trunk, reading the grain, keeping the plank true whether the shipwright had marked it straight or curved. Every plank in the hull began as a chalk line that this man had to chase with a moving blade, and a cut that wandered wasted a tree that had taken generations to grow. The second man had no such standing. He worked down in the pit beneath the log, and he was called the pitman. His job was to haul the saw down on the cutting stroke and push it back up over and over all day. He could not see the line. He could only feel the blade and trust the man above him. He stood at the bottom of a hole that filled with whatever rain and groundwater found it, so he often worked in standing water to his boots, and with every stroke the sawdust came down. It fell from the cut straight onto the man below, into his hair and his eyes and his mouth, hour after hour until the shift ended. The top-sawyer worked up in the daylight, guiding the cut. Down in the pit the other man had only the dark, the wet, and the falling dust. It was the worst job in the yard, and it never stopped. What the saw could not do, another tool finished. Once a timber was cut roughly to size, a shipwright squared it and shaped it by hand with an adze. The adze is an ancient tool, a curved blade set across the end of a handle like a hoe, swung down toward the worker's own feet to shave the wood away in slices. In trained hands it could pare a rough beam down to a smooth and exact surface, following a curve no saw could manage. Nearly every piece of Victory passed under an adze before it took its place in her. Remember the adzes? It comes back on the worst possible day. None of this was safe. The timbers were not planks a man could carry. Many weighed tons, and they were dragged and swung and lifted into place by muscle, rope, and simple tackle, often over other men working below. A slip on the wet staging, a rope that parted, a beam that turned as it rose, and a man could be crushed or maimed in a moment. The honest truth is that we do not know how many were. No reliable record survives of the men hurt or killed building HMS Victory. Some yards and some ships left grim numbers behind. Hers did not. So this account will not hand you a death toll, because to give you one we would first have to invent it, and the men who bled in that stone dock deserve better than a figure we made up. What can be said is plainer and just as heavy. The work was dangerous, it was constant, and it was done by hand, timber by timber, for years on end, And piece by piece, cut and shaped, the wood was finally ready. Every frame, every plank, every curved rib lay waiting in the yard. Now the shipwrights had to raise it into the shape of a ship. The frames rose from the keel. Along the floor of the stone dock lay the spine of the ship, and every timber the shipwrights lifted now was built up from it. If the keel was the spine, the frames were the rib cage. One at a time, great curved timbers of oak were hauled upright and set in a row down the length of the keel, each one a rib of the ship, and each rib was itself a made thing. Several lengths of oak joined into one long sweeping curve that ran from the keel up to where the decks would later sit. A first rate of 100 guns needed these ribs in their hundreds, crowded close together like the bones of some enormous animal. Until they stood, she was not a ship. She was a backbone in an empty dock waiting for a body. Setting them was brutal work, every rib a load of oak swung up and held plumb by rope and tackle and the arms of men. But it is what happened next, once the frames were standing, that most people never hear. Because a ship this size had to be held together, and the way they did it was not the way you would guess. Finished, HMS Victory weighed close to 3,500 tons. A structure that heavy you would think must be riveted and bolted through with iron. It was not. Iron played almost no part in holding her together. The smaller fastenings, and there were thousands upon thousands of them, were made of wood. They were called treenails, pins of oak driven hard into holes bored through the timbers and locked in place. Wood pinning wood. Where the load was greatest, through the massive frame timbers themselves, the shipwrights drove copper bolts, some of them close to 6 feet long, sunk clean through the oak. A warship of 3,500 tons, held together by wooden pegs and long copper rods, and hardly a rivet in her. There was hard logic under this. A ship lives in salt water, and iron and wet oak is a slow disaster. It rusts, and as it rusts it bleeds, staining and rotting the wood around each bolt, and the rust swells the iron until it splits the very timber it was meant to hold. In a few years, an iron-fastened hull would be eating itself from the inside. Copper did not rust that way. And a wooden pin did something no metal could. Soak an oak treenail and it swells, and swelling it grips tighter, until the pin and the plank around it lock into something close to a single piece of wood. Iron fought the ship, wood joined it. The men who built her knew the difference, and they built her to last in the one way that would. Stop for a moment and take in what that means. Every timber raised in this dock so far was pit-sawn by 2 men over a hole, hewn true by hand with an adze, lifted by rope and muscle, and pinned with pegs a shipwright drove himself. Not one machine with an engine had touched any of it, because none existed to touch it. If that is the story you came here for, the one nobody tells about the most famous ship afloat, stay with us, because from here she only gets stranger. There is a reason she is still with us, and it has nothing to do with her guns. For now, the frame stood finished in the dock, a vast cage of oak ribs open to the sky. From a distance, she looked like the skeleton of a beached whale, and you could see daylight straight through her sides. She was strong, and she was shaped, and she was completely open. Before she could ever float, that skeleton had to be given a skin. They called it planking, and it was the slowest, heaviest skin any warship on Earth ever wore. A ship's frame is only a cage. To make her a hull, that cage of oak ribs had to be covered over with a continuous shell of oak plank, laid the length of her, strake upon strake, from the keel up to the rails. Each strake was a line of planks running bow to stern, and each plank was its own labor. It was cut from the same oak, sawn over a pit, hewn true with the adze, and then hauled up against the curve of the ribs and worked until it lay fair against them, following the sweep of the hull with no gap the sea could find. The planks near the bow and stern were the hardest of all, forced to twist and bend around the sharpening curve where the ship narrowed to a point. Each one coaxed and beaten into a shape it did not want to take. Then every plank had to be fastened. A shipwright bored down through it and into the rib beneath with a hand auger, a long spiral bit turned by the strength of his arms alone, and drove a peg home into the hole, wood into wood, the same way the frame itself was pinned. Multiply that by the whole of her. Thousands of planks, each one lifted, shaped, bored, and pegged by hand, plank beside plank beside plank, until the daylight you could once see straight through her sides was shut out for good and she stood solid. But not every band of oak was the same. Along the length of the hull, at the places where the strain would be greatest, the shipwrights ran the whales, belts of far heavier plank, thicker and stronger than everything around them, bound about her sides like girdles. They were the great longitudinal straps of strength that held a 3,500-ton hull from working itself apart in a heavy sea. A first rate carried these massive whales in courses down each side, and every foot of them, like every foot of the ordinary planking, was cut and shaped and driven by the arms of men. Stand back and reckon what that adds up to. The forest of oak that came into this dock did not become a ship all at once. It became her plank by plank, each one a separate act of cutting and hauling and boring and pegging, repeated until the count runs past imagining. There is no single machine you can point to and name as the thing that built her. She was raised the way a stone wall is laid, one piece at a time, by hands that had set 10,000 pieces before and would set 10,000 more. And then, at last, she was closed. The skeleton had its skin. If the frame was the bones of her and the whales the muscle laid along them, the planking was the flesh, and with the flesh on she was, for the first time, a recognizable ship, a black hull, sitting high and whole in the stone dock, waiting only for the water. Waiting is the strange word for what came next, because here, with the hull finished, you would expect the story to quicken, to run on toward masts and guns and open sea. It does the opposite. The men set down their tools, and around the finished hull of the most famous warship the world would ever know, nothing happened at all. Not for a month, not for a season, for 3 years. 3 years. To see why, you have to look away from the dock for a moment and out at the war. She had been named for victory, and by the time her hull stood finished, the war that gave her that name was all but won. The long global fight that had made 1759 a year of triumphs was grinding toward its end. A navy builds ships in a hurry when it fears it will soon need them. This navy feared nothing of the kind now. It did not want another 100-gun ship rushed to sea, and so the men who had raised her set down their tools and simply left her standing where she was. But leaving her was not the same as forgetting her. She was left open, unrigged, unroofed, her finished hull standing bare in the stone dock, exposed to the Kentish sky, to the rain and the wind and the slow turn of the seasons. The yard had a phrase for it. She was left a season in frame. It has the sound of neglect. It was the single most important thing that was ever done for her. The reason is in the wood itself. Green oak, timber freshly felled, is not yet truly wood. It is heavy with sap and water, its grain still soaked with the life of the living tree. Build a ship from green timber and seal her up, and all of that moisture is trapped inside her. It has nowhere to escape to. In the dark, sealed heart of the frame it goes to work, and it rots the oak from within, or it dries unevenly and warps the great timbers until the joints strain and the seams gape. A ship closed up wet is a ship already beginning to die. Weather her slowly, and everything reverses. Season after season in the open air, the wet oak surrenders its moisture and its sap by degrees. It dries through and through, from the surface deep into the core, until the timber is stable and hard and settled forever into its shape. That is what the 3 years bought her. The long silence drove the life out of the green wood before that life could ever turn against her, and left the timber cured instead of merely idle. And so the strangest truth of her whole building is this. Of everything that made HMS Victory last, the elm laid in the wet and the copper driven through the oak, the thousands of pegs and the mass of seasoned plank, none did more for her long life than the years in which nothing was done to her at all. The most powerful machine in the whole story was never a machine. It was time. It was the weather, working on her patiently for 3 years while the men stayed away. There is a story told here and there that her timber had been stored and seasoning for many long years before a single piece of it was ever cut for her. It is a good story. It may even be true, but it hangs on one thin thread of a source. And this account will not lean its weight on a thread. What we can stand on is what happened here in the dock. She stood open. She weathered. She was made by patience into something that would not rot. And when the waiting was finally over, when the order came at last to let the river in and float her free, the strangest trouble of her entire building was waiting for her at the gates of the dock. The 7th of May, 1765. After 3 years of silence, the men came back to the dock, and the first thing they did was let the sea in. Slowly the Medway rose around the great black hull, climbing the stone walls, climbing the timber blocks she had rested on for 6 years. And for the first time in her life, HMS Victory began to lift. She came up off the blocks. She floated. 3,500 tons of seasoned oak riding free on the water at last, swung gently in the flooded dock, and pointed her bow toward the open gates and the river beyond. All that was left was to walk her out through the gates into the Medway, and she would be a ship afloat in the world. She did not fit. At first light that morning, before the water was even high, the foreman afloat had stood at the head of the dock and looked at the ship, and then at the gap she had to pass through, and felt something go wrong. His name, in the one account that has come down to us, was Hartley Larkin. He called for a measuring line. They ran it across the gates. They ran it across the widest part of her hull. And the numbers did not agree. She was broader than the way out. By the account that survived, she was at least 9.5 inches too wide to pass through her own dock gates. 9.5 inches. On a hull the length of a street of houses, it was almost nothing, and it was enough to strand her completely. The oak that had been grown for years, felled and hauled and sawn by hand, raised and pegged and planked and weathered through 3 long winters, the most famous warship on earth, finished and floating and ready, was 9.5 inches too broad to leave the room she had been built in. The dock that had made her had become the thing that would not let her go. And there was no gentle way around it. The gates were massive, a barrier of stone and timber built to hold back a tidal river. To take them out and build them wider was the work of weeks. But a tide does not wait weeks. It rises and falls twice in a day, and a ship floated up on a high tide must go out on that tide or settle back down onto her blocks and wait for the next chance. Larkin had hours, not weeks, so he did the only thing the hours allowed. He put men on the gates with adzes. The same curved blade that had shaped nearly every timber in her, swung toward a man's own feet to pare rough oak to a fair surface, was now turned against the dock itself. Dozens of shipwrights climbed onto the gates and began to cut, hewing the wood away by hand, chip by chip, paring the opening wider a fraction of an inch at a time. The tool that had built the ship was set to work carving her a way out of the dock that had built her. And it worked. All through that day the adzes bit into the gate timbers, and inch by hard-won inch the gap widened, until at last it was wide enough. When the water was high they warped her forward on ropes. There were no ways to slide down, no plunge and no wave. She was walked out, eased through the ruined gates on the water that carried her, squeezing through a gap her own builders had cut for her only hours before, until the black hull passed clear of the stone and swung out into the open river. She was free. After 6 years in the dock, after the forest and the sawpits and the frame and the long silence, after very nearly being trapped forever in the one place that made her, HMS Victory was a ship afloat at last. Everything she had been built for was waiting for her now. The sea, a war, a place in history. And then, having survived it all, she did the last thing anyone would have expected. She did nothing. After 6 years in the dock, after a forest felled and sawn and raised and pegged and weathered by hand, after the crisis at the gates that very morning, HMS Victory was warped out into the Medway, moored and left alone. She was not sent to sea. She was not sent to war. She was floated straight into what the Navy called ordinary, the reserve, and there she sat, unrigged, unarmed, no guns run out, no mast stepped, no crew aboard but a handful of caretakers. The most powerful warship in the world, finished at last, was tied up and set aside like a tool that might one day be wanted. She stayed that way for 13 years. 13 years. The 7 years' war she had been ordered for was long over before she ever touched water, and a nation at peace had no use for another 100-gun ship of the line. So the Leviathan the men of Chatham had willed out of the ground with their bare hands lay quiet at her moorings while the world moved on around her, not commissioned into active service until 1778, when a new war finally called her out. All that labor, and then all that silence. She was born ready and made to wait most of a lifetime for a reason to exist. And there is one more thing the world remembers about her that had nothing to do with the men who built her. If you picture Victory now, you may picture the bright copper sheathing running along her hull below the waterline. That copper is not part of this story. It belongs to a later chapter entirely. Not until 1780, 15 years after she was launched and long after every shipwright in this account had moved on, was her hull clad below the waterline in thousands of copper sheets, nailed on to keep the shipworm out of her timbers. The ship that came out of Chatham was wood. The copper came after. To fold it into the story of how she was made is to get her wrong, because how she was made is the whole point. Go back to where we started, to the oak hanging over the saw pit and the skeleton of a ship standing in a stone dock, shaped by nothing but muscle, hand tools, and time. Everything slow and stubborn about that work, everything that made her take 6 years and nearly cost her the dock, is the same thing that made her almost impossible to kill. The elm keel that only rots in the dry. The oak seasoned through 3 open winters until the wet was driven out of it. The thousands of wooden pegs swelled tight into their holes. She was built by hand before any powered machine of any kind existed, and that handwork has outlasted everything that came after it. Iron ships rusted through and went to the bottom. Steel ships with engines were launched and celebrated and cut up for scrap. And the wooden leviathan that the men of Chatham grew out of a forest one tree at a time is floating. Still, the oldest commissioned warship left afloat anywhere on Earth, generations after the powered ships that would one day scorn her method quietly rusted away. She was Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar. That is how the world came to know her name. But the harder, older story is the one the Dockyard wrote first, in oak and copper bolt and driven peg, years before the Admiral ever set foot aboard her. So the next time HMS Victory is named, remember what she really is. Not a battle, not a man, a forest, raised by hand into a ship and never quite allowed to die.